The morning was cold and the sun had not yet broken through the mist. He sat by the river with his boots still wet from yesterday and the line already in the water. The current moved slow, like an old man thinking. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift across the flat gray sky. There were no fish. There hadn't been for 2 days. Still he came and still he waited. That was the thing. You waited. You came back and you waited. That was what made a man. A heron passed overhead silent, large, without effort. He envied that. The ease, the quiet certainty. He thought of her. The way she used to hum to herself in the mornings when she thought he was asleep. She had gone in the spring, walked out while the rains were still falling, left her hairbrush and her scarf and the smell of her skin in the sheets. That was how women left, he thought. They didn't take everything. They left enough to make the absence worse. The line twitched and he pulled. Nothing. Just the feel of water and the ghost of a tug, like life most days. A ghost of something real. He leaned back and drank from the tin flask. It was cheap whiskey, but it was warm going down. The good things were like that. Simple, rough, and not asking for anything. Later, maybe, he'd go into town. Or not. The bar would be open and the same men would be there saying the same things. Talking about the war. About their fathers. About the government. About things they couldn't change but liked to be angry about. He didn't like talk. Not much. Most men used words like dogs used barking to keep things away. He liked quiet. The kind that settled in your bones and didn't ask you for answers. The river didn't ask either. It moved and moved and moved. Whether you came to it or not. Whether you fished or not. Whether you waited or not. By noon, he had caught nothing. He stood and packed the hook, the reel, the bait tin. His boots made sucking sounds in the wet mud. He didn't curse them. There was no point. They didn't care either. On the path back through the trees, a branch caught at his coat and tore a thread loose. He looked down at it, then let it hang. It would keep tearing later. All things did, when left long enough. When he got home, the sun was gone behind the hills. He built a fire, sat in front of it, ate cold beans out of the can with a spoon that had belonged to his brother. The beans tasted like metal and salt. That was fine. She wouldn't come back. He knew that. The knowing didn't make a difference. The river would be there tomorrow. And he would too. That was the thing. You kept showing up. You didn't wait for reason. You waited because it was what you did. He drank from the flask again and didn't think. The fire cracked once like a small gunshot. Then it was quiet again. Quiet like the deep parts of the river where the fish sleep and don't rise. And the man stared into the fire and didn't feel cold. Not yet. The wind picked up after sundown. Not hard, but enough to whisper through the gaps in the window frame. It made the house feel older than it was. He didn't mind. Houses should feel old. That meant they had lasted. He finished the flask and set it beside the fire. The embers pulsed low, red like the ends of cigarettes. He let the smoke hang in his chest before exhaling. He could almost hear her voice, the way she'd say his name when she was tired of arguing. Soft, resigned, like closing a door without slamming it. He went to bed without undressing. The cot creaked and the blanket smelled of mildew and old sweat. In the dark, he listened to the wind and the tick of the stovepipe cooling. There were no dreams. Morning came again, thin and gray. There was no rush. He moved slow, lit the fire again, boiled water for coffee that tasted like smoke and regret. Outside, frost rimmed the grass, and the trees looked like bones. The kind of morning that made you feel like part of the land. Not in any poetic way, just that you were stuck here like everything else. He walked to the river with the same steps as always. Left boot, heavier than the right from the worn heel. The trail knew him now. The trees didn't flinch when he passed. He cast the line again. The water barely moved. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the line slicing the air and the plunk of bait breaking the surface. By noon, he had caught nothing again. But he stayed. That's how it had to be. He thought of her again, but only in fragments. The curve of her shoulder when she sat at the edge of the bed, the way she'd sometimes press her forehead to his, like she was trying to listen through his skull. He had never known what to say then. Maybe she had left because of that. Maybe not. People leave for reasons they don't speak. He remembered once, years ago, his father had taken him to this same river, before it had a name in his mind, before he thought of things in terms of what was lost. They hadn't talked much either, just fished. The old man had caught 2 trout and cleaned them right there on the rocks, blood and river water mixing, like nothing was wrong with the world. He thought that was how men were supposed to be. Solid, silent, unmoved. But the line in the water kept moving, even when he didn't. That's what he noticed now. The world moved, the river moved, the fish moved, even she had moved. Only he had stayed still. That evening he caught one, a small brown trout. Nothing much, but it kicked hard in his hand, alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. He killed it with a stone and gutted it by the fire back at the shack. The blood steamed on the cold air. He ate the fish without seasoning, the skin crisped, the flesh soft and clean. The bones cracked between his teeth. It wasn't joy, it wasn't triumph, but it was something. Afterward, he sat outside the cabin on an old chair with the legs uneven. The stars were out, sharp and cold and infinite. He looked up at them and didn't think of her. He didn't think of anything. The river was still out there, somewhere in the dark, moving, always, never stopping. And tomorrow, he'd go again. That was the thing. You kept going, even when it didn't make sense. Even when the line came up empty. Even when the warmth was gone and the sounds of the house were all you had left. You went back, and you waited. The days passed like leaves in the current, slow, unnoticed, gone before you could count them. He no longer marked the time, not with calendars or clocks. The only rhythm was the river's, and it didn't care for numbers. The frost came thicker now. Mornings left the world silver, and the firewood harder to split. The cold was not cruel, just honest. It told you the truth and didn't soften it. Sometimes the wind would carry distant sounds. A truck on the county road. A dog barking from a farm long shut down. Once he heard voices. 2 boys cutting across the far ridge, laughing like they weren't yet old enough to know the weight of silence. He didn't wave. They didn't see him. That was best. He fished each day, not always for the fish, sometimes just for the shape of the cast, the feel of the rod bending in his hand, the hope, if it could still be called that, of something tugging from beneath the water's skin. A conversation, wordless and cold. An answer, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. One morning the line snagged on something solid. He pulled slow, patient, working it free. When it rose, it was not a fish, not a rock, not a log. It was a shoe. Worn, bloated, leather cracked and torn where the seams had given. A man's boot, the sole half gone. He stared at it for a long time. The river moved around his knees, careless. He didn't speak, just let the boot drop back and reeled in the line. He walked upstream that day, further than usual, past the bend where the pine trees leaned toward the water like eavesdropping priests. The air smelled of rot and pine sap, something deeper beneath it. Wet earth, old leaves, time itself. He found nothing else. That night he sat by the fire longer than usual. The bottle was empty, but he drank the dregs anyway. His hands were shaking, though he couldn't say if it was the cold or the weight of memory. The firelight made his face into a stranger's face on the window glass. He didn't look away. He thought of the war then, not all of it. Just one night. Rain falling like nails, a man beside him crying through gritted teeth, a boot missing from his foot, a small thing. The kind of thing you forget, until a river brings it back to you. The next day he didn't fish. He walked, west where the land rolled harder, where the trees were thicker and the air smelled of moss. He didn't take his rod, just the knife and the flask in his coat that no longer buttoned right at the chest. He passed the old well, long covered, the barn that leaned like a drunk against the sky. A crow sat on the roof beam and didn't fly. In the grove he sat on a stone. The trees made a circle there. He had found it once when he was young, before he had words for solitude. Now it felt like a church made by accident. He pulled a cigarette, lit it, and watched the smoke twist between the branches. He thought of her again, but differently. Not as someone lost, but as someone who had known him once. Really known him. And had left anyway. That felt important somehow. That someone could see you clear and still go. He didn't hate her for it. She had done what the river did, what the world did. Moved on. He stayed there until the light turned gold and the air tasted of snow. Then he walked back. That night he dreamed, for the first time in months, maybe years, he was on the riverbank, younger, whole. She was there too, in the shallows, bare feet in the water, hair wet, laughing without sound. He called to her, but the words didn't come. She turned and smiled, not cruel, not kind, just tired. Then she was gone. He woke before dawn, cold, throat dry, heart aching like it had been struck. He dressed slowly, boiled water, sipped it plain. When he reached the river, the mist was thick, heavy, hanging low like breath not yet released. He cast once, twice. Then he stopped. The rod stayed in his hand, but he didn't move. The river didn't ask him to, and for once he didn't ask it anything either. He stood there long and still until the sun came through, not warming him, but finding him. He stayed by the river through the morning. The light slid over the water and made the frost shine like small pieces of glass. When the mist lifted, he saw the hills clear and sharp against the sky. They looked farther away than they were, as if the world had stretched in the night. He felt tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could mend, but the kind that settled in the bones and waited. He packed the rod and walked back slow, the mud stiff under his boots. Inside the cabin, the fire was dead. The cold came in through the cracks again. He didn't light it this time. He sat at the table and looked at the wood grain. It was split and worn smooth where his hands had rested so many times. He could trace the grooves like old roads, each one leading somewhere he hadn't gone. He took out the tin box from the cupboard. Inside were things he didn't need but couldn't throw away. Letters he hadn't sent, a photograph yellowed and creased, a watch that didn't run. Her picture was in there too. He hadn't looked at it since the spring she left. In the picture, she stood in front of the same river. Her hair was pulled back, her smile small and tired, like she already knew something he didn't. He touched the edge of the paper. The image blurred where his thumb pressed it. He put it back in the box and closed the lid. The next days were quiet. The frost thickened. The trees lost what was left of their leaves. The river grew slower, the sound of it duller, like a voice fading out at the end of a story. He fished less. Some mornings he only stood there watching the water slide past. The silence had weight, but he didn't mind it. He had carried worse. Once he saw a deer cross the far bank. Its breath came in small clouds. It looked at him for a long moment, then stepped into the water. The current took it slow, and it climbed out again, shaking itself, alive and unbothered. He watched it until it vanished into the pines. That small thing stayed with him longer than he expected. That night he lit the fire again. It burned soft and steady. He cooked beans, drank water, and didn't think of anything beyond the taste. He slept deep. He woke to snow. Not much, just a thin sheet that softened everything. The river was half covered with ice near the edges. The sound of it was quieter still. He walked to the bank with no rod this time, just stood. The air was sharp in his throat. He thought of his father, of the boot in the water, of the fish that had kicked in his hand before dying. All the small things that made up a life. He sat down on the same rock where he'd first fished that spring. The cold went through his coat, but he stayed. His breath came white. The sky was empty and clean. He thought of her one last time, not as the woman who left, but as someone who had once stood here with him, both of them younger and believing in the river's promise. He smiled, a small, tired smile that felt real. He spoke, though no one was there to hear it. "It's all right," he said. "You can go." The words vanished in the wind. He stayed until his hands were numb, until the snow began again, fine and slow. Then he stood, brushed off his coat, and turned toward the cabin. The river went on behind him, moving as it always had, quiet, endless, asking nothing. And for the first time he didn't feel the need to wait. The snow deepened over the next week. It came in steady drifts that muted every sound until the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. The cabin sat half buried, the roof bowed under the weight. Smoke rose from the chimney only now and then. He burned what wood was left, sparingly, like someone rationing the last of his own warmth. He kept the path to the river open. Each morning he walked it, the snow crunching under his boots, the world white and still, except for the dark seam of the water cutting through it. The river didn't freeze in the center, just along the edges where the current slowed. He liked that. It reminded him that something kept moving, even now. He didn't fish, not anymore. He just stood by the water, watched the steam rise off its surface. Sometimes he talked aloud, not to anyone, not even to himself, just to fill the air. The sound of a man's voice in the open, carried away by the wind, could keep you alive. One afternoon he found a small bird caught between the reeds. Its wing was broken, its feathers stiff with ice. He lifted it gently and held it in both hands. It didn't fight. He carried it back to the cabin and set it by the fire. For 2 days it lived, ate crumbs from the table, drank from a tin lid. Then, on the 3rd morning, it was still. He buried it under the snow outside the door, near the roots of the old pine. He stood there a long while afterward. The silence pressed against him, heavier than before. He thought of how easy it was for things to vanish, how the world went on anyway, indifferent. There was a kind of mercy in that. The snow stopped in the night. When dawn came, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The air was brittle, sharp with cold. He boiled the last of the coffee grounds, drank it black, and dressed slow. He knew he would walk to the river again. It wasn't a decision. It was habit. The path was narrower now, the snow closing in on both sides. He moved slower. His breath hung in the air like ghosts that couldn't find their way out. When he reached the bank, he saw tracks in the snow. Not deer, not man. Something smaller. Maybe fox. They followed the river's edge, disappearing upstream. He thought of following them, but didn't. He sat instead. The sun touched the far ridge, bright and cold. He watched the light spread down to the water. For a moment, the ice looked like glass, and the river below it burned gold. He smiled, just barely. He thought, this is enough. The wind came then, gentle, lifting snow from the trees in slow white spirals. He closed his eyes and listened. The river moved. The wind moved. Somewhere, the ice cracked softly and then settled again. He stayed until he could no longer feel the cold. Then he stood, turned toward the cabin, and walked. His boots left deep, uneven prints that filled with shadow. At the door he stopped once more and looked back. The river gleamed under the pale sun, endless and quiet. He nodded once, as if to an old friend he didn't need to speak to anymore. Then he went inside, and the sound of the river faded behind him. The days shortened. Light came late and left early, and he began to notice the quiet in his chest more than the cold in his hands. He didn't fish again. The rod leaned by the door, dry, the line coiled loose around the reel. He didn't put it away. Some things weren't meant to be put away. They just waited until they no longer needed to be. Most mornings he sat at the table, facing the window. The river could not be seen from there, but he could feel it, the same way you feel a fire long after it's gone out. He stopped boiling coffee, stopped shaving, stopped writing the days down in the back of the calendar that had never left January. When the wood ran out, he burned the chairs, then the table. He took it apart with a hand axe, one piece at a time. The legs went first, then the top, split clean through the middle like a final decision. He didn't eat much. He didn't speak. He dreamed less. Sometimes he woke with a name in his mouth and he didn't know whose it was. One night, the snow came again. Not heavy, just steady. The fire had burned down to a faint orange glow, the heat barely touching the room. He sat wrapped in the old wool coat, hunched in the corner near the hearth. The picture of her was on the floor beside him. He had taken it from the box a week earlier, not to look at, but to have nearby. The wind slipped under the door like a whisper. He didn't rise to block it. He only listened. It reminded him of how she used to breathe when she fell asleep before him. That slow, even rhythm. Not peace, but rest. He closed his eyes. In the morning, the sky was clear and the snow untouched outside the cabin. No smoke came from the chimney. Inside, the fire was out. His body was found in the spring when the trail thawed and the river ran high. A hunter passed by and saw the door ajar. He stepped in, stood for a while, and said nothing. There was no note, no sign of struggle. Just a man, a coat, and an empty hearth. The rod still leaned by the door. The river still moved outside, slow and endless and without memory. It didn't mourn. It didn't stop. It didn't ask.